The sun was high in the sky as a middle-aged woman, a tourist from the United States, stepped off the bus and into the heart of a beautiful European city. She was excited to explore the historic sites, but from the start, there was something about this place that rubbed her the wrong way. The Grand Royal Palace, standing tall and proud at the center of the city, immediately caught her attention. She had seen pictures of it before, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. It was massive, with towering spires and magnificent gardens, almost like something straight out of a fairy tale. It was beautiful, but there was something about the formal atmosphere that felt a bit suffocating to her. The woman wasn't used to rules and structure. Back in her hometown, she was known for her brash attitude, and she loved to talk about how important she was. It wasn't long before her thoughts turned to the royal guards standing at attention in front of the palace. They wore tall black hats, long red uniforms, and carried impressive weapons that only seemed to add to the air of mystery and power. To her, they just looked like fancy statues, standing completely still in the hot sun. She was there to see the sights, and maybe get a picture or two, but she didn't see the royal guards as anything special. In fact, they seemed like nothing more than a bunch of formalities, something to add to the list of things tourists were expected to admire. She had heard the stories about how the guards couldn't move or speak, and to her, it seemed like a ridiculous tradition. She decided, in her mind, that it was a good idea to have a little fun with them. What harm could it possibly do? She was just a tourist, after all. Besides, she had traveled far to be here, and she wasn't about to let something as trivial as a guard ruin her fun. The woman wasn't in the best mood that day. She had been dealing with a lot of stress and was tired from her long flight. She had also been drinking, a little too much, before arriving at the palace. As she wandered through the crowds of tourists, snapping pictures and chatting in different languages, she could feel the beer still buzzing in her veins. It wasn't the best state of mind for someone walking through a royal palace, but it was the state she was in. She didn't think twice when she noticed one of the guards standing just outside the gates, his face completely stoic and unmoving. She walked up to him with a smirk on her face, thinking it would be amusing to mock the man's rigid posture. She stood right in front of him and, in a high-pitched voice, mimicked the way he stood, pretending to be just as stiff and unmoving as he was. Her voice was full of mockery, and she laughed to herself, oblivious to how disrespectful her behavior was. She continued making fun of the guard, calling out how ridiculous his position was, and how no one could possibly stand like that for hours without being completely miserable. The guard didn't flinch. He couldn't. His job was to stand still and maintain his composure, no matter what. But the woman wasn't satisfied with just mocking his posture. As she looked around, she saw a can of beer in her hand, half drunk, but still in her grasp. A thought crossed her mind, and without thinking about the consequences, she raised her arm and threw the can at the guard. The beer hit him squarely on the chest, spilling across his red uniform. The loud sound of the can hitting his uniform echoed across the crowd. The people around her froze, and for a brief moment, there was only silence. The tourists nearby turned their heads to see what had happened. Some were shocked, some were disgusted, and others quickly pulled out their phones to capture the moment. The woman looked around, laughing in what she thought was a playful way. But no one else was laughing. The guard remained still, unmoving, despite the beer dripping down his chest. He didn't respond or even acknowledge what had just happened, his professionalism on full display. But it wasn't just the guard who was affected. The tourists who witnessed the scene quickly began to murmur among themselves, exchanging glances of disbelief and disgust. It was one thing to make fun of someone, but throwing something at them, especially at a public servant like the royal guard, was another matter entirely. At first, the woman thought it was all just a harmless prank, but she didn't realize the gravity of what she had done. She didn't realize that what seemed like a fun joke to her was actually a serious insult to the people of the city. The guard wasn't just some person she could mess with. He represented something much bigger: tradition, respect, and national pride. As the woman stood there, giggling and waiting for a reaction, she had no idea that this small moment would spiral into something much bigger. Little did she know, the moment the beer hit the guard's uniform, her fate was sealed. The guard might have stayed silent, but the city around her wasn't going to. And it wasn't just about the beer. It was the way she had belittled someone in uniform, the way she had treated him as less than human, as if he was there for her amusement. What she didn't know was that there was a very real price to pay for such disrespect in this city, and she was about to find out what that price was. The tourists around the woman were still frozen in shock after the can of beer hit the royal guard's chest. Most of them were staring at the woman, unable to believe what they had just seen. Some were trying to process what had happened, while others quickly pulled out their phones to capture the moment. The woman, still giggling to herself, didn't seem to realize the seriousness of what she had just done. She looked around, expecting to hear laughter or maybe even applause, but instead there was nothing but stunned silence. For a moment, the woman stood there, waiting for a response from the guard. But he didn't flinch. He didn't move a muscle. His stoic face remained unchanged, and his eyes stayed forward, focused on his duties. It was clear that the guard had been trained to ignore such petty distractions. But what the woman didn't know was that his silence was not a sign of weakness or indifference. It was a sign of discipline and respect for the job he had been entrusted with. The people around her, however, weren't so calm. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd as the tourists exchanged surprised glances. Some were shocked at her audacity, while others were disgusted by her behavior. A few people began to shake their heads, feeling embarrassed for her. The woman, still caught up in her own amusement, didn't realize that the situation was turning quickly from a harmless joke into something far more serious. One of the tourists, an older man, shook his head in disbelief and muttered under his breath, "That's uncalled for." A couple of others nodded in agreement, but the woman didn't hear them. She was too busy laughing at what she thought was a clever prank. Her attention was more on herself than on the reactions of the people around her. What she didn't realize was that, in that moment, she had crossed a line. She wasn't just making fun of the guard. She was disrespecting something much deeper, something that the people around her held dear. As the crowd began to murmur louder, the woman's laughter faded. She looked around, trying to make sense of the change in atmosphere. The onlookers were no longer smiling or amused. They were shaking their heads, some whispering in disbelief, others clearly offended. It dawned on her that the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. But before she could do anything to recover, the sound of approaching footsteps caught her attention. The local police officers, dressed in their dark uniforms and looking serious, arrived at the scene. They had been nearby, and someone from the crowd must have called them as soon as the incident occurred. The woman's heart skipped a beat as she saw the officers' stern faces. She had never expected this to happen. She had just been having a bit of fun, right? A harmless joke. But now, as the officers closed in on her, she felt a growing sense of unease. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," one of the officers said, his voice firm and authoritative. The woman opened her mouth to protest, but the officer's tone left no room for argument. The other tourists, still staring at the scene, were now recording everything on their phones. The woman's eyes darted around, and she realized that her actions had become the focus of the entire crowd. No one was laughing anymore. No one was amused. The weight of the moment hit her like a ton of bricks. The officer led her away from the crowd and toward a nearby police vehicle. She stumbled a little, still trying to process what was happening. As she walked, the sound of whispers followed her. How could she do that? What was she thinking? These murmurs filled the air, and the woman began to feel the heat of the situation. The attention she had craved just moments before now felt like a burden, and she could feel her face turning red with embarrassment. The officer didn't say much during the walk to the vehicle. He just kept a firm hand on her arm, guiding her forward. Once she was inside the police car, the door slammed shut, and the woman was left sitting there, staring out the window in stunned silence. The reality of what she had done was starting to sink in, but it wasn't until they arrived at the police station that she fully understood the consequences. At the station, she was processed quickly. The officers took down her details, and the woman could hear them whispering among themselves, their conversation in a language she didn't understand. She tried to explain herself, but the officers weren't listening. They were already well aware of what had happened, and they didn't need her side of the story. They had seen the video that had started circulating online, and they had seen enough. As the hours passed, the woman began to feel more and more isolated. The room she was in was cold and bare, and the air felt thick with tension. She had never thought that a simple act of mocking a royal guard could lead to something so serious. But now, sitting in that room, she began to realize the mistake she had made. She had thrown a beer at a national symbol. She had humiliated not just the guard, but the entire city and its traditions. In the back of her mind, she knew she was about to face serious consequences. She had no idea what would happen next, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her time in this city had come to an end. What she had thought was a harmless prank had turned into a nightmare, and she was about to find out just how unforgiving the city could be. The hours seemed to drag on as the woman sat in the cold, dimly lit room at the police station. She tried to keep her mind busy, but all she could think about was the guard, standing so still while she mocked him and threw the beer. She couldn't believe how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. Just a few hours ago, she had been walking around the palace, admiring the beautiful architecture and thinking how exciting it would be to share her trip with friends back home. Now she found herself sitting in a police station, feeling completely helpless. Outside the small room, the sounds of people talking and footsteps echoed through the halls. But in here, everything felt distant and muffled. She had never been in a situation like this before. Her mind raced, and she tried to replay everything in her head. Maybe if she had been a little more careful, this wouldn't have happened. Maybe if she had just walked away instead of mocking the guard, none of this would be happening now. But it was too late for regrets. The moment had passed, and now she had to face the consequences. It wasn't long before an officer entered the room. He was older than the ones who had arrested her, and his expression was serious, almost like he was studying her. He didn't smile, and he didn't say much at first. Instead, he took a seat across from her and simply watched her for a moment. The woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, unsure of what to say. She had been trying to think of a way to explain herself, but the words didn't seem to come out right. The officer finally broke the silence. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The woman swallowed hard. She wanted to say something, to explain herself, but she wasn't sure where to begin. She had acted in the heat of the moment, without thinking, and now she was paying for it. She didn't know how to defend herself. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she stammered, looking down at her hands. "It was just a joke. I thought it would be funny." The officer didn't react right away. He simply nodded, as if he had heard this explanation many times before. He didn't seem moved by her words. Instead, he began to explain the situation to her in a way that made it clear this was no laughing matter. "You didn't just throw a beer at a person, ma'am," he said. "You threw it at a royal guard, a symbol of our country's history and traditions. Do you understand the gravity of your actions?" She opened her mouth to respond, but the officer continued. "Not only did you disrespect the guard, but you also mocked him in front of a crowd of people. This isn't just about you being disrespectful. It's about the values we hold dear in our society. The guard represents honor, discipline, and respect. You violated that, and now you'll have to answer for it." The woman sat there, stunned. She hadn't realized the full weight of what she had done. To her, it had been just a silly joke, something to laugh about. But to the people around her, it was a deep insult. And now, the officer's words were starting to sink in. She had crossed a line, and she couldn't take it back. "I didn't mean to offend anyone," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. The officer looked at her, his expression still unreadable. It doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is how your actions affected others. You've caused an uproar, and now we have to deal with the fallout. Your behavior has been caught on camera, and it's already all over social media. The woman's stomach dropped. She had seen people get into trouble because of videos shared online, but she never thought it would happen to her. She had no idea how much attention this incident had attracted. It wasn't just about the people in the crowd anymore. It was about the whole city, and perhaps even the entire country, judging her. The officer paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle in. Then he leaned forward slightly and said, "The people who witnessed this are angry. And not just because of what you did to the guard, but because of what it says about you. It wasn't just a joke. It was an act of disrespect, and you've made yourself a symbol of that disrespect." The woman felt a wave of shame wash over her. She had never intended for things to get this bad. She had never imagined that her actions would cause such an uproar. All she had wanted was to have a little fun, but now she realized that her idea of fun had hurt people. The reality of the situation hit her hard. The man in the guard uniform wasn't just a person she could mess with. He was part of something much bigger. He represented the values of an entire culture, something the woman hadn't fully understood until now. As the officer left the room, she was left alone again with her thoughts. She couldn't stop thinking about the guard's expression when she threw the beer at him. He hadn't reacted, but she knew now that his silence had meant something far more important than she had given it credit for. He had shown restraint. He had shown respect, even in the face of her disrespect. And she had failed to do the same. What would happen next? She didn't know. But she was beginning to realize that her trip to this city had come to a very painful end. What she had thought would be a fun adventure had turned into a nightmare she wasn't sure how to escape. The woman sat there, waiting for what seemed like hours, the silence of the room pressing down on her. Her mind was spinning, the weight of the situation slowly sinking in. She had come to this beautiful city as a tourist, expecting to have a memorable trip filled with sightseeing and fun. But now it felt like everything was falling apart. She couldn't escape the feeling that her careless actions had set a chain of events in motion that she couldn't stop. Every now and then, she could hear footsteps outside the room, and her thoughts would be interrupted by the sound of voices. Sometimes the voices were louder, and she could tell people were arguing or debating something in the hall. It only made her more nervous. Was her case being discussed? Were people angry? She could only imagine what they were saying about her. She had seen tourists get into trouble before, but nothing like this. What she had done was so out of line, and now she felt like everyone around her was judging her, waiting for her to pay the price. A few moments later, the door opened again, and an officer stepped inside. He was holding a folder in his hands, his expression stern. He didn't sit down this time. Instead, he stood by the door, looking at her with a kind of authority that made her feel small. She was still trying to get her mind around what had happened, but the officer's presence made it clear that whatever was coming next was serious. He didn't waste any time. "Ma'am, we need to move forward with this," the officer said, his voice cold. "You will be taken to court shortly. The charges against you are serious." The woman's heart sank. Court. This was beyond what she had imagined. She had hoped maybe they would just let her go with a warning. After all, it was just a prank, right? But the officer's tone made it clear that things were far more complicated. She had broken the law, and now she would have to face the consequences. As the officer left the room to make the necessary arrangements, the woman's thoughts turned to the guard. She had humiliated him in front of a crowd, throwing beer at him as if he were nothing more than a joke. He hadn't even flinched, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had disrespected him in a way that went beyond just a momentary lapse in judgment. She had insulted his role, his duty, and the values that he represented. It wasn't just a trivial thing. It was an attack on something sacred to the people of this city. She couldn't stop thinking about the video that was spreading online. The scene had been captured by several tourists, and it had gone viral within hours. People were already sharing it, commenting on it, and reacting to it. Some were furious, others were shocked, but almost everyone agreed that what she had done was wrong. Her face was everywhere now, and there was no hiding from it. She had become a symbol of disrespect, a woman who thought it was funny to make fun of the country's traditions and mock its public servants. She could feel the weight of the backlash, and it was suffocating. Her mind raced as she imagined the people who had witnessed the incident, the way they must have felt. They had seen her throw the beer at the guard, heard her mocking comments, and watched the video of the whole thing unfold. They probably saw her as a careless, disrespectful tourist, someone who didn't understand the importance of the traditions she was mocking. She had seen tourists act rude before, but she had never imagined she would be the one to cause such an uproar. As the officer returned to escort her out of the room, she tried to gather her thoughts. She had never been in this kind of trouble before, and she didn't know what to expect. The thought of going to court filled her with dread. But there was no escaping it now. She would have to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how much she regretted them. There was no way to undo the damage she had caused. The officer led her through the hallways of the police station, and as they walked, she could hear the sound of doors opening and closing, the shuffle of feet on the tile floors. Every step felt heavy, like she was walking toward an inevitable fate. The officer didn't say much as they walked, his face grim, and the tension in the air was palpable. The woman's thoughts kept swirling, but she couldn't focus on any one thing. All she could think about was how fast everything had escalated. As they reached the courtroom, the woman was led into a small, stark room where she would face the judge. The courtroom was filled with people, some of them whispering to each other, some staring at her. The woman's heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, feeling like the whole room was focused on her. She could barely make out the judge's face, but she could feel his presence. He didn't look at her with any sympathy. He looked at her as if he already knew what had happened and was waiting to make his judgment. The room fell silent as the judge began to speak. His voice was firm, and as he addressed the charges, the woman could feel her stomach drop. This was no small thing. What she had done was not just a simple mistake. It was an offense against the people and the traditions of this place. She had humiliated a royal guard, mocked their culture, and disrespected something that meant a great deal to them. The woman's hands shook as she stood there, the full weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had tried to explain herself earlier, but she realized now that it didn't matter. Her actions had consequences, and she was about to face them. As the woman stood in the courtroom, her heart continued to pound in her chest, the sound of her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The judge's eyes were focused on her now, as if he were reading every part of her soul. She could barely breathe, her hands trembling by her sides. The weight of the situation had become so much heavier than she could have imagined. She had walked into this city excited for a fun adventure, but now she found herself trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The judge's voice echoed through the room, explaining the seriousness of the charge against her. "You have disrupted the peace and disrespected our traditions. Such actions cannot be overlooked. You've not only humiliated a royal guard, but you've also insulted the honor of our country. This behavior cannot go unpunished." The woman swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. She never imagined it would come to this. She had thought it was just a silly prank, a moment of laughter. But now she was standing before a judge, facing the consequences of her actions. The courtroom felt suffocating, and she felt small, like a child caught in a mistake she couldn't fix. She wanted to apologize, to explain that she had never meant to cause harm, but the words felt stuck in her throat. The prosecutor spoke next, his voice cold and sharp. "The defendant's actions were deliberate, and the video of the incident has been shared widely. She has caused harm not only to the royal guard, but also to the people who revere him and the traditions he represents. We cannot allow such disrespect to go unpunished. The law must hold her accountable for her actions." The woman's stomach churned as the prosecutor's words sunk in. She had heard stories of people getting into trouble while traveling, But she never thought she would be the one to face such harsh consequences. The reality of the situation was now painfully clear. She had made a huge mistake, and there was no escaping it. Her heart sank even further as she thought about how this was all unfolding. Her vacation had turned into a nightmare. And now she was about to find out just how much trouble she was in. The defense attorney, who had been quiet up until now, spoke in a calm, measured tone. "Your Honor, my client deeply regrets her actions. She did not intend to cause harm or insult anyone. This was a moment of poor judgment, and she has learned a valuable lesson. We ask for leniency and understanding in this matter." The woman couldn't bring herself to look at the defense attorney. She knew that no matter what they said, the damage had already been done. The video had gone viral, and the people had spoken. The anger was real, and she could feel it all around her. Her actions had sparked outrage, and there was nothing anyone could do to undo that. She had crossed a line, and now she had to pay the price. The judge listened to the defense, but his expression didn't change. He seemed unmoved by the pleas for leniency. He knew what the law required, and he wasn't about to bend the rules for one tourist. The woman could feel his gaze on her, and she couldn't help but think that she was just another example of someone who didn't understand the gravity of her actions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke again. "The court has heard both sides, and we understand that the defendant regrets her actions. However, the law cannot be swayed by regret alone. The actions of the defendant were not only disrespectful, but they also caused harm to the reputation of this country and its traditions. This court will impose a sentence that reflects the seriousness of her behavior." The woman's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to scream, to beg for another chance, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. She had already made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. Her fate was in the judge's hands, and she could do nothing but wait for his decision. The judge looked at her one last time, his face hard and serious. "You will be sentenced to 1 year in prison for your actions. You will serve your time here, in this country, and you will reflect on the consequences of disrespecting our values. We hope that during this time, you will come to understand the importance of the traditions you have mocked." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. 1 year. She could barely believe it. She had hoped for something less severe, but the judge had made it clear that her actions had consequences, and now she would face them. Her mind raced as the reality of her sentence settled in. 1 year in prison. It felt unreal, like something that could only happen to someone else. But here she was, about to be taken away to serve her sentence. The courtroom grew silent as the judge's gavel slammed down. The woman was led away, the sound of her footsteps echoing in her mind. Her heart felt heavy, her entire body numb. She had no idea how she was going to face this. 1 year in prison felt like a lifetime. How would she survive this? What would her family think? How would she explain this to her friends back home? The questions flooded her mind, but there were no answers. All she could do was take each step forward into a future that seemed uncertain and terrifying. As the guards escorted her out of the courtroom, the woman felt like she was walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. She had no control over what was happening, and she felt completely powerless. But one thing was clear: her life had changed forever, and she would never forget the day she threw a beer at a royal guard. As the guards led the woman out of the courtroom, the weight of her situation became even more real. She barely noticed the people in the hallway, the murmurs and whispers of the onlookers. Her mind was a blur, her thoughts racing, as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The harsh reality of the judge's decision, 1 year in prison, had hit her hard. It felt like a bad dream, one that she couldn't wake up from. She had never imagined that a simple, thoughtless prank could lead to such a drastic consequence. The guards didn't speak to her as they escorted her through the corridors of the courthouse. She couldn't find it in herself to say anything either. What was there to say? What could she say? Words felt useless now. She had made a mistake, a huge mistake, and no matter how much she regretted it, The consequences were inevitable. The guilt in her chest felt like a heavy stone, weighing her down as she walked through the hallways. She thought about how her family and friends would react when they found out what had happened. She could already hear their voices in her head, their disappointment, their shock. They would never believe it. She barely believed it herself. As they approached the prison van, the reality of her punishment began to sink in. She was about to be taken to a foreign prison, where she didn't know anyone and couldn't speak the language. She had never been to prison before, and she never imagined she would be here, standing in front of a van that would take her to a place where her life as she knew it would come to a halt. The guards didn't explain anything to her. They simply opened the door of the van and motioned for her to get in. The inside of the van was cold and uncomfortable, the seats hard and uninviting. She sat in silence, feeling the chill of the air and the weight of her thoughts pressing on her. The van started moving, and she could feel the bumps of the road beneath her, each one a reminder that there was no turning back. The city she had visited so eagerly just days ago now seemed so far away. She had seen the beautiful landmarks, the grand buildings, and the busy streets, but now it felt like all of that was in another life, a life that no longer existed for her. Her world had shrunk down to this small, cramped space, and the future seemed uncertain, clouded with fear and confusion. As the van drove through the streets, the woman looked out the window, trying to take in the surroundings. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she was hoping for something, anything, that could offer some comfort. The streets were busy. People were walking by, going about their lives, but it all felt distant. She felt like an outsider, like she didn't belong here anymore. The thought of being in a foreign country, alone and behind bars, made her stomach turn. She wanted to shout, to scream for help, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. The decision had been made, and she had no choice but to accept it. The van finally came to a stop, and the guards opened the door, signaling that it was time to get out. The woman hesitated for a moment, her heart racing in her chest. The sound of the van doors creaking open felt like a finality, a signal that her fate was sealed. She had no idea what the prison would be like, but she could only imagine that it would be harsh. She had heard stories of foreign prisons, how difficult they could be for foreigners who didn't speak the language or understand the customs. The fear of the unknown gripped her, and she felt a lump form in her throat. What would happen to her in there? How would she survive? The guards led her inside the prison gates, past high walls and barbed wire, into a large building that looked cold and imposing. The building was old, its stone walls cracked and worn from years of use. It looked like a place where hope went to die. The woman felt her knees weaken as they walked through the hallways, the echo of their footsteps the only sound in the air. She was still in a daze, her mind unable to process everything that had happened. She had gone from being a carefree tourist to being locked up in a foreign prison, and she didn't know how to make sense of it. They took her to a small, empty cell. The door creaked as it opened, and the guards pushed her inside. The cell was bare, with only a thin mattress on the floor and a small window near the ceiling that let in just a sliver of light. There were no personal items, no comfort, just cold concrete and metal bars. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. She felt a wave of panic rise in her chest, her breath quickening. This was real. This was her life now. The guards locked the door behind her, and the woman sank to her knees on the mattress, burying her face in her hands. The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, and she cried. She cried for her foolishness, for the pain she had caused, for the friends and family she had disappointed. She cried for the freedom she had lost, for the life she thought she would have, and for the fear of what the future would bring. She couldn't escape this place, couldn't escape the reality of her punishment. All she could do now was wait. Wait for the time to pass, wait for her sentence to be over, and hope that somehow, when she finally walked out of this prison, she would be able to rebuild her life. But for now, all she could do was cry and wonder how everything had gone so terribly wrong. Her thoughts drifted back to the moment when she threw the beer at the Royal Guard. It seemed so far away now, like it happened in another lifetime. If only she had thought before acting. If only she had understood the importance of the traditions she was mocking. But now it was too late for if onlys. She had to face the consequences, and all she could do was pray that someday she would find a way to make it right. The days in prison felt like they were dragging on, each one blending into the next in a haze of monotony and uncertainty. The woman had tried to keep herself busy, trying to distract herself from the overwhelming sense of regret that constantly gnawed at her. She spent her time staring out the small window in her cell, watching the world outside move on while she remained trapped in her own personal nightmare. The sound of other prisoners' voices and the clanging of doors were the only things that kept her aware of the passing time. There were no luxuries here, no comforts, just cold, hard reality. Her cell was small, barely enough room for the thin mattress on the floor and the metal toilet in the corner. There were no personal belongings allowed, and her few belongings had been taken from her when she entered the prison. She felt like she was just another number in the system, a nameless face among countless others who had made their own mistakes. She missed the simple things, her family, her friends, even the comfort of her own bed. All of that seemed so far away now, like a distant memory that she could hardly hold on to. The food was basic, nothing more than bland. Unappetizing meals served in small portions. She had tried to eat what she could, but the taste left her with a sinking feeling in her stomach. The prison guards rarely spoke to her, except when it was time for her to follow their orders. She had learned quickly that there was no room for questioning, no space for defiance. If she had hoped for sympathy, she quickly realized it was a luxury she wouldn't be receiving. At first, the loneliness had been unbearable. There were times when she sat in her cell, thinking back to the day she had been taken from the courtroom. She thought about how she had been so full of life and excitement just days earlier, looking forward to a fun vacation in a new country. But now, everything had changed. The mistake she had made had turned her world upside down, and she had no idea how long it would take to put things back together. Despite the harsh conditions, she knew she had to stay strong. She couldn't afford to let herself fall into despair. She had made a mistake, and there was no going back. But the guilt, the overwhelming guilt, still haunted her every day. She had disrespected a royal guard, humiliated him in front of the people, and caused a scandal that had been shared across the globe. The video of the incident had been watched millions of times, and it felt like everyone knew who she was, even though she was now locked away in a foreign prison, far from the world she once knew. Over time, she began to interact more with the other prisoners. Some of them had been in the system for years, while others, like her, were newcomers, their faces still filled with fear and uncertainty. There were conversations that started as small talk, but as the days passed, they began to share more about their lives. Some of the women she met had made mistakes, just like she had, while others had committed much more serious crimes. In a strange way, she found comfort in hearing their stories. It made her feel less alone, less isolated in her guilt. One woman, who had been in the prison for a long time, took the time to explain the routines of the prison to her. She told her about the rules, the small rebellions people made, and how to survive the harsh environment. She didn't know if it was kindness or just a sense of solidarity, but it gave the woman a small sense of hope. For the first time in days, she felt like she might be able to survive this, that she might find a way to get through this and come out the other side stronger. It didn't make her mistake go away, but it made her feel like there was still a future waiting for her, even if it seemed far off. She also began to understand that there was no way to undo what she had done. She couldn't take back the beer she had thrown or the words she had said, but she could learn from it, grow from it. The people she had hurt were never going to forget what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make amends someday. She would have to prove that she was sorry, not just with words, but with actions. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but she was determined to rebuild her life, even if it meant taking small steps every day. Weeks turned into months, and as time passed, she began to adjust to the rhythm of prison life. It was hard, and there were days when she felt like giving up, when the weight of her punishment felt too heavy to bear. But she reminded herself that she had made this bed, and now she had to lie in it. She couldn't change the past, but she could control how she moved forward. One day, as she was sitting in her cell, a guard came by with a piece of paper in hand. It was a letter from her family. She hadn't heard from them since the day she had been arrested, and the silence had been unbearable. She quickly took the letter and tore it open, eager for any news from home. As she read the letter, she felt a mix of emotions: relief, guilt, sadness. Her family had written to her, telling her they loved her and were praying for her. They were worried, but they still believed in her. The letter didn't change her situation, but it gave her a sense of connection, a reminder that even in this lonely place, she wasn't completely forgotten. The letter also contained a small, hopeful message. "We believe you can learn from this and come back stronger," it said. "Take this time to reflect, and we'll be here when you come out." Those words gave her strength, and for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. She still had a long way to go, and the road ahead was uncertain. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this after all. She wasn't sure when, but she knew that one day this chapter of her life would be behind her. And when it was, she would be ready to start again. For now, she held on to the hope that someday she would find a way to make things right, not just for herself, but for everyone she had hurt along the way. She didn't know how, but she would keep trying, one day at a time.